The final metallic click of the lock echoed in the empty hallway, a sound more final than a gunshot. Liam stood on the splintered threshold of what had been his home, the cold brass of the key he had just surrendered still a phantom weight in his palm. His good hand tightened around the small, trusting fingers of his 7-year-old daughter, Maya. The air outside was thick with the scent of impending rain, and the sour smell of damp cardboard from the few boxes that held their entire world, now sitting abandoned on the cracked sidewalk. A sharp, familiar ache shot up from his left ankle, a cruel reminder of the fall that had started this downward spiral. He felt the hollow shame of eviction creep into his chest, a cold, heavy presence that made it hard to breathe. He could not look at the landlord, could not meet the man's pitying gaze. He just turned, pulling Maya gently with him, his limp more pronounced than ever, each step on the pavement a fresh wave of failure washing over him. The door closed, and the world shrank to just this cold, grey street corner. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the contents of his pocket, a wad of worn bills and a few loose coins. He had counted it a dozen times, as if the sheer force of his will could change the number. $150. That was it. The final severance from a life that was no longer his. His gaze drifted to their car, a rust-pocked station wagon parked at the curb, its engine having given its last rattling cough that morning. It was now just a useless metal shell, another monument to his inadequacy. A knot of pure, acid-laced panic tightened in his stomach. The city was a vast, indifferent ocean, and they were adrift in a leaking raft, with no land in sight. He felt Maya's small head rest against his side, a silent, trusting weight that felt heavier than any steel beam he had ever carried. He had to be strong for her, but the strength was gone, replaced by a nauseating fear that rose in his throat, threatening to choke him. They had nowhere to go, no one to call. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. "Daddy, are we going on a camping adventure now?" Maya's voice was a small, hopeful whisper that cut through the rumbling city noise, a blade twisting in Liam's already bleeding heart. She clutched her teddy bear, its fur worn smooth from years of affection, its button eyes staring up at him with the same innocent trust as his daughter's. He could feel the slight tremor in her body, the evening chill seeping through her thin jacket, and a soft rumble from her stomach that spoke of a lunch missed. He forced a smile, a grotesque mask of reassurance that felt brittle, like it might crack and shatter on his face. "Something like that, sweetie," he lied, and the word tasted like ash and bile in his mouth. He was her hero, her protector, the man who was supposed to build her a safe world, and here he was, on a dirty sidewalk with nothing but lies and $150 between her and the cold, hard truth of his failure. A wave of self-loathing so intense it made him dizzy washed over him. He had to keep the fear from his voice, had to maintain the illusion for just a little longer. The biting wind carried the scent of exhaust fumes and distant rain, a smell so different from the one lodged in his memory. He closed his eyes for a second, and he was back there, high on a steel skeleton, the sun warming his back. He could almost smell the clean scent of fresh-cut pine and sawdust, feel the satisfying, solid weight of a framing hammer in his hand, hear the easy laughter of his crew. He had been a builder, a creator. He took pride in the strength of his hands, in the way he could raise walls and roofs that would shelter families, keep them safe and warm. A dull, throbbing pulse from his ruined ankle jolted him back to the present. The hands that once built homes now couldn't even keep a roof over his own child's head. The accident hadn't just shattered the bones in his leg, it had shattered his purpose, his very identity. He wasn't Liam the builder anymore. He was Liam the cripple, Liam the failure, a man defined not by what he could create, but by what he had lost, and he had lost everything. The sun bled out behind the towering silhouettes of the skyscrapers, and the city began to sparkle with a million indifferent lights. Each lit window was a tiny portrait of a life he no longer had access to. Families gathering for dinner, the warm glow of televisions, the simple, unthinking security of home. A profound cold, deeper than the autumn air, settled into Liam's bones. This was it, rock bottom. The abstract fear of homelessness was now a concrete reality, pressing in on him from the hard pavement beneath his feet and the vast, dark sky above. He pulled Maya into his chest, wrapping his worn jacket around her shivering frame, her complete trust a silent accusation. Tears of shame burned behind his eyes. In the one job that mattered, he had failed. But is this truly the end for a father's love? If you believe that even in the deepest darkness a flicker of hope can be found, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. Because for Liam and Maya, this cold night on the street is only the beginning of their story. 3 days passed in a blur of cold benches and the gnawing ache of hunger, punctuated by the forced bright smiles Liam gave Maya. He spent their dwindling funds on cheap hot dogs and cups of hot chocolate for her, while his own stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. Then, on the third afternoon, huddled in the sterile quiet of a public library, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, assuming it was a debt collector. But some desperate impulse made him answer. The voice on the other end was dry, professional, and utterly detached. It was a probate lawyer from a town he'd never heard of, informing him that a man named Silas Miller, a great-uncle he didn't know existed, had passed away years ago. The estate was finally settled. Liam, being the last known relative, was the sole inheritor of Silas's only asset, a plot of land with a barn in a remote part of the state. Hope. A feeling so foreign it was painful, flickered in Liam's chest. A roof, a place to be. It felt like a miracle delivered through a telephone wire. The lawyer's words echoed in his mind, a hypnotic chant of salvation. A small plot, an old barn. He didn't care that it was old. He was a builder. He could fix it. He could make it safe. The shame that had been his constant companion loosened its grip, replaced by a surge of purpose. He spent $120 on 2 bus tickets for a journey that would take them deep into the rural heartland, leaving him with a meager $30. He bought a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and 2 bottles of water. As they boarded the rumbling bus, leaving the suffocating city behind, Liam felt a lightness he hadn't known in months. He squeezed Maya's hand, and this time, his smile felt real. "We're going to our new home. Sweetie," he whispered, the words tasting of deliverance. The bus engine roared to life, and as the concrete towers shrank in the window, Liam allowed himself to believe that their nightmare was finally over. He was a father providing for his child again, leading her not into darkness, but toward a new beginning. The journey was a long, rattling crawl through a changing world. The endless grey of the city slowly gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to wide, open fields stitched together with fences. For hours, Liam stared out the window, his mind racing with plans. He imagined reinforcing the barn walls, patching the roof, building a small, warm room for Maya inside. He could find work on a local farm, save up, maybe install a generator. The familiar rhythm of construction planning, a mental process he thought was lost to him, came back with a comforting rush. Maya, lulled by the motion, slept with her head on his lap, her teddy bear tucked under her arm. He gently stroked her hair, his heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. The hope was no longer a flicker. It was a steady flame, warming him from the inside out. He had a chance to rebuild not just a structure, but their entire lives piece by piece. The land was theirs. No one could take it from them. No one could evict them. They would be safe. They were the last passengers to get off. The bus hissed to a stop at a lonely crossroads, marked by a single, faded stop sign. The driver pointed down a dirt road that vanished into a dense thicket of trees. "Property's about a mile down that way. Good luck," he said, his voice laced with an unreadable tone. The bus pulled away, leaving them in a profound silence broken only by the rustling of leaves in a cold, sharp wind. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, clean and wild. Liam hoisted their single bag over his shoulder, took Maya's hand, and they started walking. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Maya skipped ahead, chasing falling leaves, her laughter echoing in the quiet lane. For a moment, it was perfect. It was the camping adventure she had asked for. Liam's limp felt less pronounced, his steps buoyed by the promise of what lay at the end of this path. Their own piece of the world, a place to finally rest. Then they saw it. As they rounded a final bend, the barn came into view, and the flame of hope in Liam's chest was instantly extinguished, doused by a flood of icy despair. It wasn't just old. It was a skeleton, a carcass of a building slumping into the earth. The setting sun shone through the structure, not on it, illuminating gaping holes in the walls and a roof that looked more like a colander. Entire sections had caved in, leaving jagged splinters of wood pointing at the sky like broken bones. The barn leaned at a sickening angle, as if a strong gust of wind would be enough to finish the job and flatten it completely. Liam's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a fixer-upper. This was a ruin. The lawyer's dry voice came back to him, a cruel mockery. An old barn. He had clung to those words, built a future upon them. And now they collapsed around him just as surely as this building would. His stomach churned with nausea. The $30 in his pocket felt like 30 tons of lead. "Wow, Daddy, it's a giant spooky treehouse," Maya exclaimed, her voice filled with a child's awe, completely oblivious to the catastrophe standing before them. Liam couldn't speak. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet, the world tilting on its axis. He had led them here. He had spent almost all their money to bring his daughter to this death trap. The walk toward the structure was the longest of his life, each step heavier than the last. As they got closer, the full scope of the decay became horrifyingly clear. The air grew thick and heavy, a putrid cocktail of wet rot, animal droppings, and a musty, cloying smell of long-standing neglect. A large, weathered sign, hanging by a single rusted nail, read Miller Farm. The letters almost completely faded. It wasn't a sign of ownership, it was a tombstone. He felt a fool, a desperate, pathetic fool who had traded the known danger of the city streets for this isolated, crumbling nightmare. He pushed on a large barn door, and it came off its hinges with a groaning shriek of tortured metal, crashing to the ground in a cloud of dust and rot. The inside was even worse than he had feared. The floor was a treacherous landscape of broken boards, piles of sodden hay, and filth. Pigeons cooed mournfully from the skeletal rafters, their droppings coating every surface in a chalky white film. In the dimming light, Liam could see the dark, scurrying shapes of rats disappearing into the shadows. The wind whistled through the countless holes in the walls, a low, mournful sound that seemed to mock his arrival. It was colder inside the barn than it was outside, a damp, penetrating chill that seeped into his bones. He could feel Maya press closer to his leg, her fantasy of a spooky treehouse quickly dissolving in the face of this terrifying reality. Liam's throat was tight, his heart hammering against his ribs, not with hope, but with pure, unadulterated terror. He had promised her a home, a safe place. What he had brought her to was a cage of splintered wood and disease, miles from anywhere, with no electricity, no running water, and no one to hear them scream. The shame he'd felt on the city sidewalk was nothing compared to this. This was a new, deeper level of failure, a profound and absolute betrayal of his daughter's trust. He saw a rusty water pump in a far corner, and his heart leaped for a second, a dying spasm of hope. He worked the handle furiously, putting his whole body into it. The pump groaned and wheezed, spitting out a trickle of brown, foul-smelling sludge before seizing up completely. Nothing. No water. He sank to his knees in the filth, the rough texture of the broken floorboards digging into his skin. The last of his strength, the last of his manufactured optimism, drained out of him, leaving a hollow void of despair. He had failed, utterly and completely. The sun disappeared completely, plunging the barn's interior into a near-total darkness, a blackness so complete it felt solid, pressing in on them. The temperature dropped sharply, and the autumn cold began its assault. Liam could hear Maya's teeth chattering. He pulled her into a tight embrace, trying to shield her with his own body, but he was cold too, his thin jacket no match for the damp chill. The wind howled through the broken roof, carrying the scent of rain. Soon, that rain would be pouring in on them, turning the filthy floor to mud. He had thought Rock Bottom was a city street corner. He was wrong. Rock Bottom was this, huddling in a collapsing, rat-infested shell with a sick child, no resources, and the full weight of a brutal winter bearing down on them. This wasn't a shelter. It was a grave, and he had led them right to it. The silence was broken by a soft sob from Maya. "Daddy, I'm scared." Liam's heart shattered into a million pieces. He had tried to protect her from his fear, but the sheer horror of this place was too much for even a child's imagination to overcome. He held her tighter, his own body trembling uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from a tidal wave of grief and self-hatred. He had gambled their last dollar on a ghost story, a whisper of a promise from a dead man, and he had lost everything. He was a builder who couldn't build, a father who couldn't protect. The familiar pain from his ankle flared, a dull, throbbing counterpoint to the sharp agony in his soul. He looked around in the oppressive darkness, his eyes seeing nothing but the absolute end of the line. The scent of mold was suffocating, the sound of the wind like a predator circling its prey. He had dragged his daughter from the frying pan of urban poverty directly into the fire of rural desolation. There was no escape. There was no one to call. This was worse than being homeless. This was being forgotten by the world. He felt around in the darkness, his hands brushing against damp, splintered wood, and something soft and foul. He needed to make a space for them, some small corner that could pretend to be safe for the night. He had to keep moving, had to fight the paralysis of despair that threatened to consume him. For Maya, it was always for Maya. Using the faint light from his dying phone, he found a corner where a small section of the roof remained miraculously intact. He kicked away the worst of the debris and the filth, his movements frantic and clumsy. He laid down his own jacket on the grimy floorboards, a pathetic offering against the cold and the dirt. "Here, sweetie," he said, his voice a hoarse crackle he barely recognized. "We'll sleep here tonight. It'll be okay." It was the most blatant lie he had ever told. As he settled Maya onto the jacket, he felt a profound sense of being trapped, not just in this barn, but in a life he no longer controlled. He sat with his back against the rotting wall, Maya curled in his lap, and listened to the symphony of decay around them, the creak and groan of the dying structure, the frantic scratching of unseen creatures in the walls, the lonely howl of the wind. Each sound was a nail in the coffin of his hope. The city, with all its dangers, at least had people, lights, the possibility of a helping hand. Out here there was nothing. An abyss of silent, indifferent nature. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing down, crushing his spirit. He had brought them here to find a roof over their heads, and instead, he had found a place where they could disappear without a trace. He could feel the cold seeping up from the ground, through his clothes, a relentless invasion. He wondered if they would even survive the night, if the barn would collapse on them, or if they would simply freeze. He thought back to the lawyer's call, the dispassionate voice that had set this disaster in motion. He had been so desperate, so willing to believe in any lifeline, that he had never once questioned it. He hadn't asked about the condition of the property, its location, its viability. He had just heard land and barn, and his broken mind had built a palace out of thin air. Now, sitting in the stinking, cold reality, his naivety felt like a criminal offense. The anger at himself was a hot, burning coal in his stomach. He was 35 years old, a grown man, and he had behaved like a hopeful child, running towards a fantasy, and he had dragged his own daughter along with him. The weight of his responsibility was suffocating. He was her entire world, and he had led that world to the edge of a cliff. The first drops of rain began to fall. They were soft at first, a gentle patter on the few remaining shingles above them. Then the downpour started. Water cascaded through the countless holes in the roof, hitting the floor with a sound like 100 tiny drums. The small, dry patch he had found for them began to shrink as water seeped across the floorboards. A steady drip started just a few feet away, then another and another. Soon, the entire barn was filled with the sound of the storm, the outside world invading their flimsy shelter. Liam pulled Maya even closer, trying to cover her completely, but he could feel the dampness starting to soak through his shirt. He was failing even at this, failing to keep her dry for a single night. The cold, the dark, the rain, the fear, it all coalesced into a single overwhelming thought. He had made the biggest mistake of his life. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to escape the sight of his own failure. But there was no escape. The image of Maya, shivering and scared in this rotting hellscape, was burned into his mind. The scent of decay was the new scent of his life. The sound of the wind was his new lullaby. The false hope had been crueler than the initial despair. It had lifted him up just high enough to make the fall fatal. He had been a man with nothing but $150. Now he was a man with $30, a terrified child, and a collapsing barn in the middle of nowhere as a storm raged around them. He had reached the bottom, and he had started to dig. There was no way out. There was no hope left. He was completely and utterly broken, a ruin himself, just like the worthless inheritance that had lured him to his doom. The grey morning light that filtered through the skeletal roof was merciless, illuminating a scene of total devastation. The rain had turned the filth on the floor into a stinking, semi-liquid slurry. Puddles of brown water stood everywhere, reflecting the broken rafters above. Maya was huddled in his arms, her small body radiating a feverish heat, her breath coming in shallow, raspy coughs. The damp cold had found its way into her lungs. A new kind of terror, sharper and more immediate than the despair of the night before, seized Liam. It was a primal fear, the fear of a parent watching their child sicken in a place of filth and decay. The hollow ache of his own hunger was nothing compared to the fire of panic that now burned in his gut. He had to do something. Sitting here and waiting was a death sentence. Despair was a luxury he could no longer afford. His misery hardened into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He would not let her die here. He would not let this ruin be their tomb. He gently laid Maya down on his jacket in the driest spot he could find, a small island in a sea of muck. Her eyes were glassy, her face pale except for 2 feverish spots of red on her cheeks. "I'm cold, Daddy," she whispered, her voice weak. The words were like a physical blow. He had to create warmth. He had to create safety, even if it was just a few square feet of it. He looked around the barn, not as a home, but as a resource pile. His builder's eyes, clouded for so long by failure, began to scan for anything useful: broken but dry timbers for a fire, flat boards to raise them off the damp floor, a section of wall that could serve as a windbreak. It wasn't about building a future anymore. It was about surviving the next 12 hours. He found a piece of rusted sheet metal that had fallen from the roof. It would be a start. He would build a small, defensible space, a pocket of order in this sprawling chaos. His body ached, but his mind was suddenly terrifyingly clear. He worked with a grim, silent efficiency, his limp a dull, throbbing rhythm accompanying his labor. He dragged heavy, waterlogged timbers away from the corner, his muscles screaming in protest. He found several relatively intact floorboards from a collapsed section of the loft and began laying them over the damp ground, creating a raised platform. The work was brutal, his hands quickly becoming raw and blistered. The air he breathed was thick with the stench of rot and mold, but he forced it down, focusing only on the task. Sweat mingled with the grime on his face. He wasn't thinking, just doing. Each board he laid was a small victory against the decay. Each piece of debris he cleared was an act of defiance. He was no longer a victim of this place. He was at war with it. He was a father carving out a foxhole for his child. Driven by a force more powerful than any despair, the simple prey to animal instinct to protect his young at all costs. As he worked, his mind a numb buzz of physical exertion, Maya stirred. She sat up, pulling his jacket tightly around her shoulders, and watched him with listless eyes. She was too weak to play, but her child's curiosity remained. Her gaze drifted around the small, cleared space he had made. Her eyes, closer to the floor, noticed details he had missed. She shuffled her feet on the new platform he'd built, then stopped. She moved her foot again, a small, tentative slide. A sound, distinct and out of place, broke the silence. A hollow rattle. "Daddy," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "This board is wobbly." Liam, balancing a heavy piece of timber, barely registered her words. "It's all wobbly, sweetie," he grunted, his focus entirely on not dropping the beam on his foot. The entire structure was a collection of wobbly boards. Her observation meant nothing in the grand scheme of their crisis. He had to keep working. "No," she insisted, her voice a little stronger. "Listen." She tapped her foot again. Clack, clack, rattle. It was different from the solid thud of the other boards he had laid. It was a loose, hollow sound, as if there were nothing but air beneath it. Liam paused, the heavy timber still in his arms. He sighed, a plume of breath in the cold air. His first instinct was to ignore it, to tell her not to play around. It was a distraction. But then he looked at her small, pale face, her eyes wide with the seriousness of her discovery. He owed her this, at least, to listen. He carefully set the timber down and limped over, kneeling on the platform beside her. The cold from the boards seeped through the knees of his jeans. "Show me," he said, his voice softer than he intended. The simple act of kneeling, of focusing on her small discovery, felt like a return to a forgotten tenderness. Maya pointed a small, trembling finger at the board. This one. Liam pressed down on it with his hand. The wood was solid enough, but it moved, depressing a fraction of an inch more than the others, and the sound was undeniable. A dull, empty clatter. Not the sound of a board on a dirt floor, but the sound of a board hitting the edges of a joist equines with a void underneath. A flicker of something, a feeling he couldn't name, cut through the cold fog of his exhaustion. It wasn't hope. It was curiosity, a sharp, focused interest that momentarily pushed aside the overwhelming dread. In a place where every inch was defined by decay and ruin, this small anomaly, this hollow space, was a secret. It was a question mark drawn on the floor of their prison. He pressed it again. Clack, clack, rattle. His heart beat just a little bit faster. This was not random decay. This was deliberate. Someone had made this. He needed a tool. His eyes scanned the debris pile he had created. Among the splintered wood and rusted metal, he saw it. The tire iron from their broken-down car, which he'd brought in case he needed to break something. It seemed like a lifetime ago. He retrieved it. The cold steel, a solid, reassuring weight in his hand. Kneeling again, he examined the edges of the rattling board. The nails were old, their heads rusted into the grain of the wood, but the wood around them was soft, pulpy with decades of damp. He wedged the flattened tip of the tire iron into the thin crack between the boards. He put his weight on it, using his good leg for leverage. There was a high-pitched, groaning screech of tortured metal as the old nails resisted. Then pulled free from the decaying joist below. The board lifted, then came loose in his hand with a final, splintering complaint. He tossed the board aside and peered into the opening. A square of perfect blackness was revealed in the damp earth beneath the floor. It was a hole, about 2 feet by 2 feet, dug neatly into the ground, and nestled in the center of that dark, loamy soil was something else. It was man-made, its form obscured by the gloom, but its unnatural straight lines stood out against the organic shapes of the dirt and roots around it. His breath caught in his chest. He felt a strange premonition, a sense of standing on a precipice. He reached into the cold, damp space, the smell of rich earth filling his nostrils. His fingers, numb with cold, brushed against a surface that was hard, metallic, and pebbled with corrosion. It was a box. A cold thrill, part fear and part excitement, shot up his arm. He wasn't just clearing debris anymore. He was digging up a secret. His fingers curled around the object and he lifted it out. It was a small tin box, perhaps for biscuits or tea, but it was heavy, far heavier than it should have been. Its surface was a mottled landscape of orange and brown corrosion, the original paint and design almost entirely eaten away by time and moisture. It felt ancient, a relic from another era. He shook it gently. Nothing rattled. Whatever was inside was packed tightly. He sat back on his heels, the box resting on his knees, and stared at it. The barn, his sick daughter, the gnawing hunger, it all receded for a moment, replaced by the potent mystery of this object. Who had put it here and why? This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate act of concealment. The care taken to hide it spoke of value, of desperation, of a story that ended right here, under the floor of this forgotten barn. He tried to open it, his raw fingers slipping on the rusted lid. The seam was fused shut by decades of oxidation. He gritted his teeth, a surge of adrenaline giving him strength. He inserted the tip of the tire iron into the lip of the lid and twisted. With a piercing, grating shriek of metal on metal, the seal broke. The lid popped open, releasing a puff of stale air that smelled faintly of dust, dry paper, and something else. The faint, metallic tang of old brass. He tilted the box toward the weak morning light, his heart hammering against his ribs. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark, rotted fabric that might have once been velvet, lay 2 items. They seemed to absorb the dim light, glowing with a secret significance. His eyes widened. He had expected nothing, or perhaps some worthless trinkets. He had not expected this. The world suddenly felt larger, filled with possibilities he couldn't have imagined a moment before. He reached in with a trembling hand and picked up the first object. It was a key, not a simple iron key, but a large, ornate brass one. It was heavy in his palm, the metal cool to the touch. The head of the key was fashioned into a complex, interlocking knot, a piece of intricate craftsmanship that spoke of value and importance. The bit was complex, with multiple teeth designed for a sophisticated lock. It was a key that belonged to a safe or a special chest, or a door that guarded something precious. He looked around the ruin of the barn. There were no doors with locks like that, no chests, no furniture. There was nothing for this key to open. It was an answer without a question, a beautiful, useless piece of brass that only deepened the mystery. Its presence here was a paradox, a clear sign of wealth and security hidden in a place of abject poverty and decay. His attention shifted to the second item in the box, a small, rectangular photograph. Its edges curled and its surface faded to a pale sepia. He picked it up carefully, afraid it might crumble to dust in his fingers. He blew gently on its surface, clearing away a film of grime. It was a portrait of a young woman, maybe in her late teens or early 20s, with dark hair and a look of quiet confidence. She stood with one hand on her hip, a faint, proud smile on her lips, and behind her, unmistakable, was the barn. But it was the barn of a different time, a dream of a barn. The wood was new and bright, the roof was whole, the massive doors hung straight and true, and on the wall, painted in crisp, bold letters, was the sign he had seen hanging by a single nail, Miller Farm. This was her home, this was her legacy, and someone had buried her memory under the floor. Liam sat there on the rough-hewn platform, the cold key in one hand, and the ghost of a proud young woman in the other. The oppressive weight of his own failure began to recede, pushed aside by the powerful gravity of this newfound story. This barn was no longer just a symbol of his bad luck. It was a place with a history, a secret. The key and the photograph were not just objects, they were narrative threads, pulling him out of his own despair and into a mystery that was far older and deeper. For the first time since arriving, he felt a flicker of something other than fear or desperation. It was a sharp, electrifying jolt of purpose. He wasn't just a squatter in a ruin. He was an archaeologist. He was a detective. And he had just found the first two clues. The puzzle was laid out before him, and he felt an overwhelming compulsion to solve it. The immediate need for survival was now inextricably linked with the need to know more. The key was the next step. It had to open something. Something within this barn. Maya, sensing the shift in his energy, sat up straighter. "What is it, Daddy?" she asked, her voice still hoarse. "I don't know yet, sweetie," he said, and for the first time, his voice held a genuine spark of excitement. "But I think this might be the start of a real adventure." He stood up, his body still aching, but his mind was now a whirring engine of speculation. The key was too well hidden, too ornate, to be for a simple padlock. It was for something integrated into the structure itself, something that was meant to be invisible. He began to scan the barn again, but with new eyes, looking not for flaws, but for design. He was no longer looking for what was broken, but for what was hidden. He started a systematic search, a grid pattern in his mind. He ran his hands over every remaining inch of the wooden walls, feeling for hollow spots, for hidden panels, for anything that felt out of place. The rough, splintered wood scraped his already raw fingertips, but he barely noticed. He checked the rusted hinges of the fallen doors, the frame of the empty hayloft, the very beams of the roof he could reach. Nothing. The key remained a solid brass question in his pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the unsolved puzzle. Frustration began to creep back in, but it was a different kind of frustration now. It wasn't the hopeless despair of before. It was the active, gnawing frustration of a detective hitting a dead end. He was so close to something, he could feel it. The answer was here, staring him in the face, but he couldn't see it. The barn held its secret tightly. His gaze fell upon the one part of the structure that had remained untouched by time and rot, the foundation. It rose about 4 feet from the ground, a solid wall of large, grey fieldstones, fitted together with the skill of a master mason. While the wood above had surrendered to the elements, this stone base was as solid and impassive as the day it was laid. It was the only part of the barn that spoke of permanence. A thought struck him, so improbable that he almost dismissed it. What if the lock wasn't in the wood at all? What if it was in the stone? It seemed impossible. How could you hide a lock in a solid stone wall? But the key was not for a wooden door. It was for something more secure, something more permanent. With a renewed sense of direction, he moved to the back of the barn, to the stone wall that had been at his back all night. He knelt, the cold of the stone seeping into him, and began his inspection. He ran his hands over the rough, textured surfaces of the stones, feeling the coarse mortar in the gaps between them. It was a slow, methodical process. Stone after stone. He felt and tapped, listening for any variation in sound, looking for any sign of a seam or a crack that wasn't natural. The wall was a massive, three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle, and he was searching for a single piece that didn't quite fit. He worked his way along the entire perimeter, his hope beginning to fade with each foot of solid, unyielding stone he covered. It was a crazy idea, a desperate hunch. The secret was likely lost forever. The container for the lock rotted away or destroyed in the barn's long collapse. He was chasing a ghost. He was about to give up when he reached the corner where they had slept, the very spot where he had leaned his back against the wall in despair. His fingers, almost by muscle memory, traced the outline of a large, squarish stone at about eye level as he knelt, and he felt it, a subtle difference in the texture of the mortar. Along the top and right side of this particular stone, the mortar was slightly smoother, the color a shade lighter than the crumbling, darker mortar surrounding the other stones. It was an almost imperceptible difference, one he would never have noticed if he wasn't looking for it with such desperate intensity. His heart began to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm in his chest. He pulled out the tire iron, his hand shaking slightly, and used the sharp tip to gently scrape away a fleck of the newer mortar. Beneath the thin layer of concealment, he saw it, a dark, vertical slit. It was no bigger than a thumbnail, almost perfectly camouflaged in the shadowed crevice between the stones. A keyhole. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. It was real. The whole crazy theory was real. He had been sleeping just inches from the answer all night. The ingenuity of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just a hidden lock. It was a lock disguised as part of the very fabric of the wall, a secret hiding in plain sight. He fumbled in his pocket, his clumsy fingers closing around the heavy brass key. It felt warm now, alive with potential. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the dusty air filling his lungs, and he held the key up to the impossible keyhole, the intricate knot of its head seeming to align with the ancient stone. With a hand that trembled with anticipation, he inserted the tip of the key into the slit. It slid in perfectly, the metal moving with a smooth, oiled precision that defied the decades of neglect. A soft, satisfying click echoed in the cavernous silence of the barn, a sound of purpose and design. He turned the key. There was no sound of a bolt retracting. Instead, he heard a low, deep grinding from within the wall, the sound of stone moving against stone, of a mechanism long dormant stirring to life. The large in-square stone he had been examining, and the section of wall around it, began to move. It didn't swing out. It pivoted inward, rotating on some unseen axis, revealing a dark, rectangular opening in the foundation. It was a doorway into the earth, a passage into the barn's deepest secret. Liam stared, speechless, into the darkness. A wave of cool, dry air washed over his face as he knelt before the opening. It was a smell entirely different from the rot and decay of the barn. This was the scent of preservation, a dry, clean smell of aged leather, old paper, and sealed air. It was the smell of a time capsule. His eyes, adjusting to the gloom within the compartment, made out several large, dark shapes. He reached in, his arm disappearing into the wall, and his hand closed around a thick, leather strap. He pulled. The object was heavy, far heavier than he expected, and he had to use both hands to drag it out into the light. It was a large satchel, made of thick, dark leather, its surface coated in a fine layer of grey dust. It was old, but the leather was still supple, the stitching intact. It had been protected from the moisture that had destroyed everything else. He set the satchel on the platform next to a wide-eyed Maya, his fingers, trembling with a mixture of fear and awe, fumbled with the two stiff brass buckles that held it shut. The leather straps were stiff, and it took all his strength to work them free. Finally, the last buckle came undone. He lifted the heavy top flap, his heart feeling like it was going to beat its way out of his chest. He wasn't prepared for what he saw. He didn't know what he had expected, but it wasn't this. The satchel was filled to the very brim with the soft, rich, unmistakable glow of gold, not jewelry, not trinkets, coins, hundreds of them, stacked in neat rolls, each one stamped with the image of a springbok, gold Krugerrands, a king's ransom, lying in a dirty leather bag on a makeshift floor in a ruined barn. The sight was so impossible, so world-altering, that his mind simply refused to process it. He reached in and let a handful of the coins run through his fingers. They were heavy, solid, real. The sheer, staggering reality of it made him feel dizzy. He numbly opened the second satchel. It was also filled with gold. His breath came in ragged gasps. He turned to the other 3 bags. He unbuckled one, and it wasn't gold, it was cash. Thick, dense bricks of old, high-denomination banknotes, wrapped in paper bands. He opened the other 2. More cash. It was a fortune, a life-changing, logic-defying fortune. He had come here with $30 and a dying hope. Now he was staring at a treasure that was beyond his wildest comprehension. It was the stuff of fantasy, of pirate stories, but it was real, and it was here. He felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in his throat, a sound that was half joy and half terror. This much money wasn't a solution. It was a complication. It was dangerous. After the initial shock subsided, a new thought surfaced. Why? Why was all this here? This wasn't just savings. This was flight money. This was the liquidated assets of a life, converted into untraceable gold and cash and hidden away. This was a story of desperation. His eyes were drawn back to the dark compartment in the wall. There had to be more. He reached back into the cold, dark space, his hands searching the very bottom of the stone-lined cavity. His fingers brushed against another object, flat and rectangular, wrapped in a thick, waxy material. He drew it out carefully. It was a package, wrapped in heavy black oilcloth and tied securely with twine. It felt different from the satchels. It was rigid. It was the piece he was missing. It was the context. It was the story. He placed the package on the floor and carefully unwrapped the oilcloth, which cracked and flaked at the corners. Inside, perfectly preserved from the damp, were 2 items. The first was a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with the single initial T. The second was a stack of legal documents, their paper yellowed with age but the ink still clear, all tied together with another piece of simple twine. He opened the journal. The inside cover read, "Property of Thomas Miller." Miller, the same name as the faded sign, the name of his distant great-uncle. But this journal, these documents, this immense fortune, this wasn't the story of a quiet death. This was the story of a violent disappearance. He held in his hands not just a treasure, but the evidence of a crime. The reason for the photograph, the key and the hidden fortune was about to be revealed. Liam's hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of the story he now held. He gently opened the leather-bound journal. A wave of dry, musty air, the scent of time itself, rose from the pages. The handwriting was neat, a looping cursive in faded black ink. The first entry was dated 1965. It spoke of hope, of building this very barn with his own hands, of the pride he felt looking over his small but thriving farm. He mentioned his wife, taken by illness, and his daughter, Sarah, who he called his sunshine, the reason for all his hard work. Liam felt a ghostly kinship with this man, this Thomas Miller, a father, alone, building a world for his child. He ran a finger over the crisp, dry paper, the intimate thoughts of a dead man laid bare before him. The silence of the barn seemed to deepen, as if holding its breath, waiting for the past to speak through these pages. The weight in Liam's chest was no longer just his own despair. It was now mingled with the phantom hopes of a stranger. He turned the pages, the tone of the journal slowly shifting over the years. By the early 1970s, a thread of anxiety began to weave through the entries about crop yields and weather. Thomas wrote of a growing shadow over the valley, a name whispered with fear in the local town, Alistair Finch. He described Finch not as a man but as a force, a wealthy industrialist who arrived with political connections that reached into the new military government. Thomas wrote, "Finch doesn't buy land, he consumes it. He moves with an unnatural hunger, and the law seems to bend to his will." Liam felt a chill creep up his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. He could hear his own heart beating a slow, heavy drumbeat in the quiet, the scratching of a rat in the wall suddenly sounding like a warning. The story was turning dark, and he felt like an intruder, a trespasser on a field of buried pain, unable to look away from the horror he was unearthing. The horror became explicit a few pages later. An entry from 1976. The Andersons are gone. They refused Finch's insult of an offer. Last night, their barn burned to the ground. The sheriff called it an electrical fire, but they had no electricity. Liam's breath hitched in his throat. He looked over at Maya, her small form curled under his jacket, her face still pale with fever. The historical danger in the journal suddenly became a present, terrifying possibility. The abstract words on the page, fire, refused, took on a visceral, sickening reality. Thomas Miller's fear bled through the ink, a palpable terror that crossed the decades and settled into Liam's own heart. He wrote of feeling trapped, of seeing his neighbors vanish one by one, their lands absorbed into Finch's ever-expanding empire. The journal was no longer a simple farm log. It was a chronicle of slow, methodical extinction, written by a man who knew he was next on the list. The plan began to form in the journal's pages, born of pure desperation. Thomas realized he could not fight. He could not win. His only remaining purpose was to save his daughter, Sarah, the proud young woman from the photograph. He wrote, "I cannot save my home d'Estoise, but I will save her future. I will turn their greed against them. I will convert this earth and wood into something they cannot trace, something small enough to carry." Liam's eyes darted to the heavy leather satchels, the gold, the cash. It wasn't a windfall, it was an escape plan. Thomas detailed the secret liquidation, selling equipment for cash in a distant city, quietly trading his last cows for Krugerrands through a contact. The immense weight of the satchels suddenly felt different to Liam. It was not the weight of wealth, but the dense, heavy weight of a father's desperate love and terror, a final, defiant act against a faceless evil that was stealing his world piece by piece. Liam set the journal aside and picked up the stack of legal documents, his fingers clumsy with a new and dreadful understanding. He unrolled them carefully. At the top was the official, notarized deed for the Miller farm, legally registered and clean. Thomas's name was clearly printed. This land was his. It was now Liam's. But beneath it were other papers, photocopies of sale agreements from neighboring farms, each one signed over to a Finch County Holdings Corp. The sale prices listed were criminally low, a pittance for fertile land and family homes, and stapled to each was a copy of a withdrawal slip from the same bank for the same meager amount. Thomas had been gathering evidence. He hadn't just been planning to run, he had been planning to expose the entire criminal enterprise. The sheer, cold-blooded scale of the theft was breathtaking. This wasn't business. This was conquest. His hands shook as he returned to the journal, turning to the final pages. The handwriting became more hurried, the confident loops giving way to sharp, angular script. The last full entry was dated October 12th, 1978. It is done. The last of it is hidden. The mechanism works. Sarah doesn't understand why we must leave the home she loves, but she trusts me. We leave at dawn. We will make it across the border. We will be free. A sliver of hope, a final glimmer before the darkness. Liam held his breath and read the last frantic scrawl. Written with such force that the pen had nearly torn the page. The ink was smeared. It was a postscript, an epitaph. Finch's men are at the door. They are shouting my name. May God protect us. The words stopped there. The rest of the page, and the rest of the journal, was blank. The silence that followed was absolute, filled only by the terrible, unspoken answer to what happened next. A wave of acrid nausea rose in Liam's throat. He slammed the journal shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous barn. He now knew the truth. This was not a treasure. It was a memorial. The fortune was the life savings of a man murdered for his land, a dowry for a daughter who never got to have a future. The photograph of the proud young woman mocked him with its lost vitality. The key in his pocket felt impossibly heavy. The entire barn was no longer just a ruin. It was a crime scene, and the fortune was Exhibit A. A profound, chilling connection formed in his soul between himself and Thomas Miller, two fathers, separated by decades, trying to protect their daughters against a world determined to crush them. The secret was no longer Thomas's alone. It had been passed on, The heavy burden of this buried truth now rested squarely on Liam's shoulders, and he had no idea what to do with it. Just as that thought crossed his mind, a sound tore through the morning stillness. An engine. It was a low rumble at first, a sound so alien in this profound isolation that it felt like a violation. It grew steadily louder, closer, the unmistakable sound of a truck coming down the dirt road. Panic, cold and sharp, stabbed through Liam. This was no accident. No one came here. His mind raced. He shoved the journal, the documents, and one of the smaller satchels of banknotes into the worn backpack that held their few belongings. He couldn't carry it all. He frantically pushed the heavy leather bags of gold and the remaining cash back into the hidden stone compartment. His heart hammered against his ribs as he strained to pivot the heavy stone section of the wall back into place. It clicked shut with a soft, grinding finality. He kicked loose dirt and debris over the seams, praying it was enough to hide the lines. A sleek, black pickup truck, its paint gleaming and tires thick with mud, crunched to a stop 30 yards from the barn. The aggressive, modern vehicle looked like a predator that had wandered into a boneyard. The engine cut out, and the silence that rushed back in was heavier, more menacing than before. Liam's throat went dry. He grabbed Maya, who was now awake and watching with wide, fearful eyes, and pulled her behind a pile of collapsed timbers, pressing a finger to his lips. He peered through a gap in the rotting planks. His breathing shallow. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was young, maybe 30, wearing expensive jeans and a clean, tailored jacket that screamed of casual wealth. He glanced at the dilapidated barn, not with surprise, but with an air of impatient ownership, as if inspecting a chore that needed to be dealt with. The man began walking toward them, his polished boots making loud, confident crunching sounds on the gravel-strewn dirt. He moved with an easy swagger, the assurance of someone who had never been told no in his life. His eyes scanned the ruin with a look of detached distaste, until they landed on the small, cleared corner where Liam and Maya were hiding. He saw them. A slow, disarming smile spread across his face, a practiced mask of friendliness. "Well now, what do we have here?" he called out, his voice smooth and laced with an Ivy League accent that was utterly alien to this place. "So I heard rumors someone had moved into the old Miller place, but I didn't believe it. I'm Jonathan Finch." The name landed like a punch to the gut. Finch, the spider's grandson. Liam felt the blood drain from his face, the journal's words echoing in his mind. The past was not dead. It was standing right in front of him. Jonathan Finch's eyes swept over them, taking in Liam's worn clothes, his own grimy state, and Maya's small, shivering form. His practiced smile tightened with a flicker of condescension. "Looks like you folks have hit a rough patch," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "My grandfather, Alistair, he owns just about every acre in this county. This one little plot has always been a thorn in his side, a loose end. It's more of a sentimental thing for him now, you understand. Likes things tidy." He gestured vaguely at the skeletal barn, a dismissive wave of his hand. The lie was so smooth, so effortless. It was clear he had told versions of it his whole life. Liam's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had to stay calm. He had to play dumb. He was staring into the face of the monster from Thomas Miller's journal. "Look," Jonathan continued, stepping closer and lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "This property is worthless. It's a hazard. The county is going to condemn it any day now, and you'll be trespassing. But my grandfather, he's a generous man." Liam could feel the bile rise in his throat at the word generous. "He's authorized me to make you an offer to help you get back on your feet. $5,000. Cash. You take it. Pack up your things and be gone by noon. It's a fresh start." The offer hung in the cold, damp air, a carefully calculated lure. $5,000. Yesterday, that sum would have been a miracle, a deliverance from God. Today, knowing what he knew, it was a disgusting insult. It was the price of silence. They were testing him, trying to see if the ghost of Thomas Miller had left anything behind. Liam's mind spun, a frantic search for the right words, the right reaction. He couldn't accept, but he couldn't refuse outright. He had to seem like what he appeared to be, a desperate, broken man. He looked at the filthy ground, avoiding Jonathan's piercing gaze. I don't know," he stammered, letting his voice tremble. "My daughter. She's sick. This is the only place we have. He let the sentence hang, an appeal for pity he did not feel. He just needed to buy time. He needed them to go away so he could think, so he could figure out how to escape this closing trap. Jonathan's smile faltered. His eyes narrowed slightly. The friendly mask began to crack. He had expected immediate, grateful compliance. This hesitation, this briefest moment of defiance from a man who had nothing, was not part of the plan. It made him suspicious. The entire atmosphere shifted. The thin veneer of civility evaporated, replaced by a palpable menace that was colder than the autumn wind. Jonathan's smile returned, but it was different now. It was a predator's smile, devoid of all warmth. "You should consider the offer very carefully," he said, his voice dropping to a low, almost intimate murmur that was infinitely more terrifying than a shout. "It's more than generous." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over them. "These old, isolated places, they can be awfully dangerous." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the silence. Funny things happen. A stray spark from a campfire, a forgotten lantern. It would be a terrible, terrible tragedy if a fire were to happen out here. Especially, he added, his gaze flicking meaningfully toward Maya, with a child around. The threat was delivered as smoothly as the offer, a promise of violence wrapped in the language of concern. Without another word, Jonathan Finch turned his back on them and walked with that same confident swagger back to his truck. The message had been delivered. He climbed in, the door slamming shut with a sound of chilling finality. The engine roared to life, and with a spray of mud and gravel, the black truck reversed and disappeared down the dirt lane, leaving Liam and Maya alone in a silence that was now thick with poison. Liam was trembling, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that came not from the cold, but from pure, unadulterated terror. He was no longer just the accidental keeper of a historical crime. He was the new loose end. The monster Thomas Miller had tried to flee was old, but its fangs were still sharp. And its grandson now knew someone was living on the land they had killed for. That immense, impossible fortune was no longer a path to salvation. It was a beacon, attracting the very evil it was created to escape. What would you do? Would you take the dirty money and run, burying the truth forever to protect your child? Or would you stand your ground and fight for justice, knowing it could cost you both your lives? The roar of the truck's engine faded, but the silence it left behind was a ringing in Liam's ears, a high-pitched frequency of pure dread. The threat had not been a shout, but a whisper, and its venom now coursed through his veins, a cold poison that paralyzed him where he stood. Jonathan Finch's words played over and over in his mind, a looping nightmare of casual cruelty, a tragic fire, especially with a child around. The air itself felt thin, stolen from his lungs. He looked down at Maya, who was staring up at him, her small hand clutching his pant leg, her big eyes reflecting his own terror. The primal, protective rage that flared in his chest was a white-hot nova, momentarily burning away the fear. They weren't just threatening him, they were threatening her. The abstract horror of Thomas Miller's journal was no longer a historical document. It was a blueprint for his own imminent destruction. Every instinct, every fiber of his being screamed one word: run. But run where? The dirt road was a choke point, the wilderness an impassable wall. The isolation that had been a symbol of his failure was now a perfectly constructed execution chamber. He stumbled back into the deeper shadows of the ruin, pulling Maya with him. His mind, which had been so clear just an hour before, was now a chaotic storm of panic and tactical calculation. He had to get out. He had to disappear before they came back, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they would be back tonight. His eyes darted around the crumbling landscape of his prison. The truck had come from the main road, the only way in or out he knew of. Going back that way was suicide. He would be a mouse walking into a snake's mouth. His gaze drifted past the edge of the property line, through a stand of skeletal autumn trees. In the distance, almost lost in the haze of the grey afternoon, he saw it, a thin, almost imperceptible wisp of white smoke rising straight into the still air. A chimney, another house, a neighbor. The thought was a desperate, grasping lifeline. It could be another enemy, another pawn of the Finch empire, but it was the only direction that wasn't a dead end. It was a gamble against impossible odds, but it was the only one he had left to play. The decision made, a frantic energy took hold of him. There was no time for careful planning. Every second he remained here was a second closer to the moment fire would consume them. He checked the hidden compartment in the wall, his fingers tracing the faint outline of the stone. The bulk of the fortune, the heavy gold, had to stay. It was an anchor, and he needed to be a ghost. He hoisted the worn backpack, its weight now immense with the burden of truth it carried. The journal, the condemning documents, and the single satchel of cash he'd grabbed. It was enough. If they could just get away, it would be enough to start again, somewhere far from this cursed valley. He knelt in front of Maya, forcing his face into a mask of calm he was nowhere near feeling. "Okay, sweetie," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We're going to play a new game now, a quiet game. We have to go on a secret walk and not make a single sound." Maya nodded, her feverish eyes wide and serious. She understood the fear, if not the reason for it. She was a child, but she was a survivor. He took her hand, the small, hot fingers wrapping around his. Her coughs were quieter now, but a faint wheeze lingered in her breath. He had to get her somewhere warm, somewhere safe. He looked back at the ruin one last time, the place that had represented a false hope, then a crushing despair, and then a shocking mystery, now felt like his own open grave. The ghosts of Thomas and Sarah Miller seemed to whisper on the wind, whistling through the broken planks, a desperate warning to succeed where they had failed. He turned his back on the barn and, with the backpack heavy with a dead man's story, he stepped into the tangled woods that separated his land from the plume of smoke in the distance. The undergrowth was thick, clawing at his clothes. Every snapping twig under his feet sounded like a gunshot. His limp, aggravated by the uneven ground and the frantic pace, became a searing agony in his ankle, a constant, throbbing reminder of his vulnerability. But he pushed on, driven by the image of Jonathan Finch's cold, dead smile. The woods were a labyrinth of shadow and silence. The air was cold and smelled of leaf mold and damp earth. Liam moved with the desperate stealth of a hunted animal, his senses stretched to their breaking point. Was that the wind or a whisper? Was that a falling branch or a footstep behind him? The paranoia was a physical thing, a creature riding on his shoulders, its claws digging into his neck. He carried Maya for long stretches, her small body a precious, fragile weight against his chest, her shallow breaths warming a small patch of his shirt. He could feel her shivering, a fine tremor that vibrated through his own body. He had to keep going. The house was his only beacon. As they drew closer, he could see it more clearly through the thinning trees. It was a small, neat cottage, a single story, with a dark green roof and clean white walls. Unlike his ruin, this house was loved. Flowers, withered by the frost, still stood in a tidy garden bed. It was an island of order in a sea of encroaching wilderness, a fortress of defiance. He paused at the edge of the woods, his heart hammering against his ribs. The house was quiet, too quiet. What if he was wrong? What if he was about to deliver himself and his daughter into the hands of another enemy? The risk was immense. He watched the front of the house for a full 5 minutes. A statue carved from fear. There was no movement. The smoke from the chimney was the only sign of life. He had come this far. There was no turning back. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, he broke from the cover of the trees and walked across the 50 yards of open, manicured lawn that separated him from the cottage's front door. He felt exposed, a target in the open, every window a potential eye staring at him. His limp was more pronounced now, each step a testament to his pain and desperation. He reached the simple wooden porch and stopped, his knuckles hovering just inches from the door, his courage failing him at the final moment. He had no right to bring his danger, his chaos, to this peaceful place. The door opened before he could knock. A woman stood there, small and ancient, her body made frail by a century of seasons. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but her eyes, a pale, piercing blue, were as sharp and clear as a winter sky. They held no surprise, only a deep, weary sadness, as if she had been expecting him his whole life. She was Elara. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves, but there was no malice in it, only a profound sense of caution. "This isn't a safe place for you anymore." Her gaze dropped to Maya, who was half hiding behind Liam's legs. and a flicker of something pained and gentle crossed her face. Liam, speechless, felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. This was not an enemy. This was something else entirely. He didn't know how she knew, but she knew. His gamble had paid off. He was not alone anymore. His voice, when he finally found it, was a broken croak. I have nowhere else to go. They're coming back." Ilara's sharp eyes met his, and in them he saw a flicker of the same terror he felt. But it was an old fear, a familiar companion. She nodded slowly, an ancient, knowing gesture. "I know," she said softly. "They always come back." She stepped aside, holding the door open wider. "Get inside. Bring the child." The inside of the cottage was a stark contrast to the world outside. It was warm, impossibly warm, with the heat from a cast-iron stove radiating through the small, tidy room. It smelled of wood smoke, dried lavender, and beeswax. It was the scent of safety, of a life lived with care and intention. He guided Maya inside, and the little girl, exhausted and sick, immediately gravitated toward the warmth of the stove, her shivering slowly beginning to subside. Liam felt as though he had stepped out of a nightmare and into a forgotten dream. The simple comfort of the room, the profound safety of its four walls, was so overwhelming that tears prized at the corners of his eyes. He had forgotten what it felt like not to be terrified. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, the backpack feeling like a lead weight. He didn't know what to say, how to begin to explain the insanity he was dragging behind him. He didn't have to. Ilara closed the door, the solid thud of the bolt sliding home a sound of profound security. She turned to him, her gaze unwavering. "You found something in that barn, didn't you? Something Thomas left behind." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Liam could only nod, his throat tight. He slowly unslung the backpack, laid it on a small, handmade wooden table, and pulled out the old sepia photograph. His hand trembled as he held it out to her. "I found this," he whispered. I think her name was Sarah." The moment Ilara's eyes fell upon the image of the proud young woman, her carefully maintained composure shattered. A deep, guttural sob escaped her, a sound of grief that had been held captive for half a century. Her frail body shook, and she reached out a gnarled hand, not to take the photo, but to gently, reverently, trace the outline of Sarah's face with a single trembling finger. "Sarah," she wept, the name a ghost on her lips. "Oh, my sweet Sarah." Tears streamed down the deep channels of her wrinkled cheeks, each one a testament to a lifetime of silent mourning. She looked up at Liam, her blue eyes swimming in sorrow. "She was my best friend," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We grew up together in this valley. We were inseparable. We were going to run away together, see the world. But she loved her father, and she wouldn't leave him." The photograph in Liam's hand was no longer a clue. It was a relic, a sacred artifact of a stolen friendship and a broken promise. He felt like a profane intruder, a clumsy archaeologist who had accidentally unearthed a still bleeding wound. He stood frozen, unsure of what to do or say in the face of such raw, ancient pain. He had come looking for an ally, and he had found the keeper of the flame, the last living witness to a crime everyone else had forgotten. He had found the guardian of the story. Ilara slowly regained her composure, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. The sorrow in her eyes was replaced by a hard, cold fury that seemed to give her frail body an impossible strength. She looked from the photograph to Liam's face, her gaze intense. "You have the right to know," she said, her voice now steady and low. "You have the land. You have her picture. You have the right to know what they did." She motioned for him to sit at the small table, and she took the seat opposite him. The warmth of the stove was a stark contrast to the chilling story she began to tell. She spoke of the valley before Finch, a place of small farms and close communities. She spoke of Alistair Finch's arrival, of his cold ambition, and the way he used the political chaos of the military dictatorship as a weapon, preying on the isolated and the powerless. Her words were a living echo of Thomas Miller's journal, a second voice confirming the nightmare from across the decades. She described the fear that had spread like a cancer through the valley, the sudden fires, the accidents on the road, the families who packed up and fled in the middle of the night, selling their legacies for pennies. Thomas was different, Ilara said, a spark of pride in her voice. He was stubborn, and he was smart. He saw what was happening. He told me he wouldn't let Finch have the satisfaction of taking his land for nothing. He said he was building an ark for Sarah, to help her float away from the coming flood. The ark, the hidden fortune. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place, forming a picture of unimaginable evil and incredible courage. Liam listened, spellbound, the journal and documents in his backpack no longer just evidence, but the testament of a brave man's final, desperate act of love. He wasn't just protecting a fortune, he was protecting a legacy. Then Ilara's voice dropped to a haunted whisper, and she leaned forward, her sharp eyes boring into Liam's. "I was there," she said, the words barely audible. "The night they disappeared, I was a girl, just 16. I was supposed to meet Sarah by the old oak tree. She was going to give me a letter to mail for her, a secret. But she never came." The air in the warm room grew thick, heavy with the weight of her confession. I got worried. I snuck through the woods, close to the barn. I was hiding in the thicket, just beyond the light from their windows. And I saw it all. She paused, closing her eyes as if to conjure the terrible memory she had suppressed for 50 years. Liam held his breath, his own fear a distant echo of the fresh terror in her voice. He was about to hear the answer to the journal's final, frantic entry. He was about to learn what happened after Finch's men came to the door. "A big black car pulled up," Ilara continued, her eyes still closed tight. "No headlights until the very end. 2 men got out. They were big, shadows in cheap suits. They dragged Thomas out of the house. He was fighting them, shouting for Sarah to run. Then they went back in and pulled her out, too. She was crying, calling for her papa." Ilara's voice broke, and a fresh tear traced a path down her cheek. I was frozen. I was so scared I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I just hid in the dark, like a coward. They shoved them both into the back of the car. Thomas was still fighting. One of the men hit him with something. He went limp. She opened her eyes, and they were filled with a half-century of self-loathing. They drove away, down the dirt road, and about a minute later, I heard it. She stopped, her body rigid. Just one. A single gunshot, echoing through the valley, and then silence. A silence that has lasted for 50 years. Liam felt the blood run cold in his veins. A single gunshot. The final, brutal punctuation mark to Thomas and Sarah's story. They hadn't escaped. They hadn't made it to the border. They were murdered in cold blood and discarded. Their existence erased by the insatiable greed of one powerful man. The fortune hidden in the wall wasn't an escape plan that had failed. It was the entire material value of 2 human lives, left to rot in a stone tomb. The full, monstrous weight of the secret he had uncovered crashed down on him. This was so much bigger than him, so much bigger than his own problems. He was standing on the forgotten grave of a family, and he held the only proof that they had ever existed. He looked at Ilara, at this old woman who had carried the horror of that night alone for 5 decades, and he understood her fear, her isolation, her fierce refusal to sell her own land. Her farm wasn't just a home, it was a vigil. "I never told anyone," Ilara whispered, her confession finally complete. "I was terrified. My parents were terrified. We knew what would happen if I spoke. The sheriff was Finch's dog then, just like he is now. We would have been next. So I stayed quiet. I watched Finch's empire grow, built on the bones of my neighbors, on the grave of my best friend, and I've lived with the shame of that silence every single day." She looked down at her gnarled, clasped hands on the table. "I always prayed that one day someone would come, that Thomas's cleverness would outlast Finch's evil, that someone would find what he hid." Her pale blue eyes rose to meet his again, and for the first time, they held not just sadness, but a fierce, burning hope. "You found it. After all these years, you found it. The proof." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. What will you do with it? Before Liam could answer, before he could process the enormity of her revelation, Maya let out a series of deep, ragged coughs, her small body shaking with the effort. Ilara was on her feet in an instant, her ancient grief replaced by practical concern. "The child is burning up," she said, her voice sharp with authority. She placed a cool, papery hand on Maya's forehead. "We need to get this fever down. She needs rest, and she needs to be safe. She looked at Liam. You will stay here tonight. No one will look for you here. Finch thinks I'm just a crazy old woman he can't scare. He leaves me alone. The small, cozy cottage, which had felt like a sanctuary, now felt like the only defensible position in the entire world. Here, with this brave, broken woman, they had a chance. Out there in the darkness, the wolves were gathering, and they had already tasted blood on this land. Ilara moved with a quiet efficiency, preparing a cool cloth for Maya's head and brewing a pungent herbal tea that smelled of mint and chamomile. It will help her breathe, she explained. Liam watched her, his mind reeling. He had stumbled into a 50-year-old war, and this frail woman was its last, lone soldier. Her fear was real, but beneath it was a core of pure, unyielding steel. She had been waiting. She had been guarding the memory of her friend, waiting for a weapon to fall into her hands. And he had just delivered it. The journal, the documents, the story of a crime that was not yet over. He felt a strange and powerful bond with this woman he had just met, an alliance forged in the crucible of a shared enemy and a shared commitment to a justice that was long overdue. For the first time, he was not just running from something, he was running toward something. As dusk settled outside, painting the windows a deep, bruised purple, a fragile sense of peace settled over the small cottage. Maya, soothed by the tea and the warmth, had fallen into a deep, quiet sleep on a small cot Ilara had prepared. The storm of the last few days had finally passed, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. But Liam knew it was the calm before a much larger, more violent storm. He sat at the table, the journal open before him. Ilara sitting opposite, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. They were a strange pair of conspirators, the broken-down builder and the octogenarian hermit, bound together by a dead man's secret. He won't let it go, Ilara said softly, her eyes fixed on the darkening woods outside her window. Jonathan's visit, his offer, it was a test. Your hesitation was your answer. He knows you found something, or at least he suspects it. Alistair Finch doesn't tolerate loose ends. He never has. Her words hung in the quiet room. A prophecy of the violence to come. Liam knew she was right. The friendly mask of Jonathan Finch had hidden the face of a killer, and now that mask was off. They wouldn't come back with another offer. They would come back with fire. The threat had been a promise. His skin crawled at the thought. The image of the barn consumed by flames, with him and Maya trapped inside, flashed through his mind, so vivid it made him gasp. He looked at Ilara, her face etched with a lifetime of vigilance. "What do we do?" he asked, the question feeling foolish and naive. He had the evidence, he had the money to run, but they were trapped on an island, surrounded by an ocean of Finch's power. How could they possibly hope to escape? He felt the old despair creeping back, a cold tendril wrapping around his heart. The cottage was safe for now, but it was still just a cage. Ilara's gaze was steady. "For 50 years. I have been a prisoner of my fear," she said, her voice low and hard as stone. "I let him murder my friend and steal this valley, and I did nothing but hide, because I was alone, but I am not alone anymore." She nodded toward the backpack. "You have the proof, I have the story. Together we are something new. We are a reckoning." A fire lit in her ancient eyes, a fire that had been banked for half a century, waiting for a wind to stoke it into a blaze. "We will not run, Liam, not anymore. Running is what he expects. Running is what Thomas tried to do. We will fight." The conviction in her voice was absolute, a force of nature that swept away Liam's own doubt. He looked at his sleeping daughter, then back at the determined old woman, and he felt his own fear transmute into a cold, hard resolve. She was right. He had been running his whole life, from his grief, from his failure, and now from this new threat. The running stopped here. The plan was simple, desperate, and hinged on a single, fragile thread of hope. Ilara had a number, a phone number she had kept written on a faded piece of paper, tucked into an old book, for decades. It was the number of a human rights lawyer in the capital, a man her father had known, a man who had made a name for himself fighting the abuses of the dictatorship. "He is old now, if he's even still alive," she said, "but he was a brave man, an honest man. If we can get this evidence to him, he will know what to do. He can go to the federal authorities, go over the heads of Finch's puppets in this county." It was a long shot, a prayer whispered into the darkness, But it was a plan. It was a path forward. Their task was to survive the night, and at first light, Elara would make the most important phone call of her life. The thought of it, the possibility of justice, was a light so bright it was almost blinding. The hours ticked by. Darkness fell completely, a thick, starless blanket of black. The silence of the countryside returned, but now it was charged with a terrible anticipation. Liam found he couldn't sit still. He paced the small cottage like a caged animal, every creak of the floorboards, every hoot of a distant owl, sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him. Elara sat in a rocking chair by the window, a silent, unmoving sentinel. Her eyes were fixed on the darkness in the direction of the Miller barn, her vigil of 50 years finally culminating in this one terrible night. Liam checked on Maya. She was still sleeping peacefully, her fever slightly down. Her face relaxed in the soft glow of a single oil lamp. The sight of her innocence, her complete unawareness of the mortal danger they were in, both broke his heart and strengthened his resolve. He would not let her become another Sarah Miller. He would not let this story repeat itself. It was close to midnight when Elara stiffened. "Lights," she whispered, her voice a sharp hiss in the quiet room. Liam's blood ran cold. He rushed to the window, peering over her shoulder. Far in the distance and through the black skeletons of the trees, he saw them, two pinpricks of light, cutting through the darkness, moving slowly down the dirt road. But they didn't drive all the way to the barn. The headlights cut out, plunging the world back into an even more profound blackness. They were on foot now. They were trying to be quiet. "They're here," Liam breathed, his voice barely a whisper. The moment had arrived. The waiting was over. The attack had begun. The tiny, warm cottage suddenly felt like the most fragile, vulnerable place on earth. The sense of safety he had felt was an illusion. A temporary reprieve before the final confrontation. The past was no longer knocking. It was breaking down the door. Elara was already moving, her frail body animated by a lifetime of preparing for this exact moment. "There's no time," she said, her voice calm and clipped, the voice of a soldier under fire. "They will go for the barn first. They'll want it to look like an accident, just like they did with the Andersons. That gives us time. But not much." She hurried to the back of the cottage, to a small pantry. She pushed aside a rack of preserved jams and jellies, revealing a section of the wall that was not wall at all, but a low, narrow door, perfectly concealed among the shelves. "My father built this when Finch first came," she explained, her hands working a hidden latch. "He always said it was better to have a back door nobody knows about." The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a rush of cold night air and the dense, inky blackness of the woods behind the house. It was an escape route, a path to survival that had been waiting for half a century. Liam didn't hesitate. He gently lifted a sleeping Maya from the cot, her small body warm and limp in his arms. He wrapped her in a thick wool blanket, murmuring reassurances she couldn't hear. He slung the backpack, heavy with its priceless burden of truth, over his shoulder. He was ready. He looked at Elara, this incredible, courageous woman, and felt a surge of overwhelming gratitude. She was saving them. She was giving them a chance that Thomas and Sarah never had. Her face was grim in the lamplight, her jaw set. "The path leads straight through the woods to the old county road, about a mile from here. It's overgrown, but it's there. You follow it east. Don't stop for anything." She pressed a heavy, old-fashioned flashlight into his hand. "Go. Now. I will follow you as soon as I make sure the path is clear." The unspoken part of her plan hung in the air. She would stay behind, a diversion, to buy them precious seconds. Just then, a faint, acrid smell drifted in through the open back door. It was a chemical smell, sharp and unmistakable on the clean night air. Gasoline. Liam's stomach plummeted. They were dousing the barn. They were preparing the funeral pyre. The smell was the smell of his own death sentence, the one he had just barely managed to outrun. He could almost hear the glug-glug-glug of the fuel pouring over the dry, ancient timber, the wood that Thomas Miller had raised with his own hands. The thought of it, the sheer, destructive evil of the act, filled him with a cold, clear rage. He wanted to scream, to run out there and fight them with his bare hands, but he looked down at Maya's sleeping face, and he knew his fight was not here. His fight was to get this story out, to get this evidence into the right hands, to make sure that the fire they were setting would not be the end of the story, but the beginning of their downfall. Ilara stood by the main window, hidden in the shadows, her eyes fixed on the distant barn. "I can see them," she whispered, her voice tight with tension. "Two of them. They're moving around the perimeter. They're being thorough." The casual, methodical way they went about their work was the most chilling part. This was a job to them, a routine. How many other fires had they set? How many other lives had they erased with a match and a can of gasoline? Liam clutched Maya tighter, the warmth of her body a fragile shield against the encroaching cold of the night. He had to go. Every second he hesitated was a second stolen from their escape. He gave Ilara one last look, her silent thank you that encompassed everything. She met his gaze and gave a single, unsharp nod. "Go." He turned and slipped through the hidden pantry door, plunging into the absolute blackness of the forest, the smell of gasoline chasing him like a hungry ghost. The path was barely a path at all, more of a suggestion of a trail marked by a subtle parting in the undergrowth. The flashlight beam cut a weak, trembling tunnel through the oppressive dark. Branches whipped at his face, and thorns tore at his clothes. The ground was uneven, a treacherous landscape of roots and rocks that threatened to trip him at every step. His ankles screamed with a white-hot agony, but he ignored it, his entire focus narrowed to two things: protecting the sleeping child in his arms and following the phantom trail. The sounds of the forest were deafening in the silence. The frantic scurrying of unseen creatures, the creak of tree limbs swaying in the wind, the pounding of his own blood in his ears. He was running blind, putting his faith in the path laid out by Ilara's father 50 years ago, a path designed for this very purpose, to flee from the darkness of Alistair Finch. After what felt like an eternity, he risked a glance back. Through a gap in the trees, he could see it. A faint, flickering orange glow began to illuminate the distant barn from within. It started small, a candle in a window, then grew with an unnatural, terrifying speed. The fire had been lit. He could imagine the roar as the gasoline-soaked wood ignited, the flames greedily consuming the dry, rotten structure. They were burning the evidence. They were burning the crime scene. They were trying to burn the ghosts of Thomas and Sarah Miller, to erase them from the very earth. But they were too late. The ghosts were not in the barn anymore. The ghosts were in the journal in his backpack. The ghosts were in the memory of the old woman in the cottage. And the ghosts were with him, running through the darkness, finally on their way to tell their story after 50 long years of silence. The fire wasn't an ending. It was a signal fire, announcing that the battle had finally begun. He pushed forward with renewed determination, his pain and fear burned away by a cold, righteous fury. He was no longer just a father protecting his child. He was a messenger. He was the courier of a dead man's last will and testament. He was the instrument of a justice that had been delayed for half a century. Behind him, the orange glow grew brighter, casting long, dancing shadows through the woods, turning the skeletal trees into grotesque, clawing figures. The fire was a ravenous beast, and he could hear its faint, hungry roar on the wind. But he did not look back again. He focused on the narrow beam of his flashlight, on the next step and the next. He followed the path, a testament to a father's foresight, leading him away from the inferno and towards a fragile, uncertain dawn. He was carrying the story, he was carrying the proof, and he was carrying his daughter. It was all he had left in the world, and it was everything. He stumbled out of the woods and onto the hard, cracked asphalt of the old county road. The sudden openness was disorienting after the claustrophobia of the forest. The air was cold and clean, but the sky behind him was now a sickly, pulsating orange. The entire valley was lit by the pyre of the Miller barn. He looked up and down the empty road. There was nothing, just an endless ribbon of black disappearing into the darkness in both directions. He listened. The roar of the fire was a distant, angry murmur. But there was another sound, a closer one. The sound of soft, hurrying footsteps on the path behind him. He spun around, raising the heavy flashlight like a club, his heart leaping into his throat. A small, wiry figure emerged from the tree line, breathing heavily. It was Ilara, a thick shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She had made it. She had not stayed behind. She had followed him. "They'll see the fire for miles," she panted, her breath pluming in the cold air. "The real sheriff, the state policeman will have to come. But they won't find anything, not without us." She looked at Liam, her face illuminated by the terrible glow of the fire. "Now," she said, her voice filled with an iron resolve, "we make the call." Standing on the cold asphalt of the deserted road, bathed in the hellish orange glow of the distant fire, Ilara pulled a small, worn piece of paper from her pocket. Her hand, though wrinkled, was rock-steady. "He told me to call this number if the worst ever happened," she said, her voice cutting through the night air with a new, sharp authority. She led Liam to a rusted, forgotten payphone at the crossroads, a relic from a time before Finch owned the silence. The receiver was cold and heavy in her hand. She fed coins into the slot with practiced deliberation, her fingers dialing the number she had memorized 5 decades ago. Liam held his breath, clutching a now awake and whimpering Maya. The line clicked. It rang once, twice, and then a voice answered. It was old, weary but sharp. "Thorn." Ilara closed her eyes. "My name is Ilara Vance," she began, her voice trembling but unbroken. "I live in the valley. I am standing with the heir to the Miller farm, and I have proof of what Alistair Finch did to them." The meeting was arranged for dawn in a small, anonymous diner 2 towns over. Marcus Thorn, the human rights lawyer, was a man whose physical fragility was betrayed by the fierce intelligence in his eyes. He listened, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee, as Liam laid the story bare. The eviction, the false hope, the discovery, the threat. He spoke with the raw, unvarnished urgency of a man who had stared into the abyss. Then, he pushed the backpack across the table. Thorn opened the journal first, his expression unreadable as his eyes scanned the pages, his jaw tightening as he reached Thomas's final, frantic entry. He examined the deeds, the photocopies of the fraudulent sales, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He looked up at Liam, then at Ilara, who sat like a statue of silent affirmation. "For 50 years, Thorn said, his voice a low growl of controlled rage, "I have heard whispers of Finch's kingdom. Whispers, you, son, have brought me the crown jewels of his crimes." Thorn made only 2 phone calls. The first was to the Attorney General's office, invoking a personal marker from a case decades ago. The second was to the head of the Federal Crimes Division. He didn't shout or plead. He spoke with the cold, irrefutable weight of fact. Liam, sitting in the corner of a safe house Thorn had arranged, could hear the clipped, authoritative tone. "The evidence is absolute. The primary witness has been silent for 50 years. The local authorities are compromised. This needs to be a federal operation, clean and fast, before he can destroy the rest of the evidence or silence the heir." The wheels of justice, so often slow and grinding, began to turn with breathtaking speed. It was a power Liam had never imagined, a force moving through unseen channels, completely bypassing the web of fear and corruption that Finch had spent a lifetime weaving around his valley. The monster was being hunted, and for the first time, Liam felt the intoxicating sensation of not being the prey. Dawn broke over the Finch estate, a sprawling mansion built on stolen land and silenced screams. But this dawn was different. It didn't arrive with the gentle song of birds, but with the silent, menacing approach of a dozen dark federal sedans. Agents, clad in black tactical gear, swarmed the property with a terrifying, silent precision, a wraith-like army emerging from the morning mist. Alistair Finch, a shriveled ancient man lost in a silk robe, was met on his grand marble staircase not by his servants, but by federal agents. His face, a mask of aristocratic arrogance, crumpled through stages of confusion, outrage, and finally, the vacant, impotent terror of a king whose walls had been breached. The defining moment came when an agent laid out the recovered Krugerrands on his priceless, polished desk, the gold coins glowing in the morning light like small, accusing suns. The life savings of a murdered farmer, now the evidence that would bring down an empire. The trial was a spectacle, but the outcome was never in doubt. Jonathan Finch's sneering confidence evaporated when the court played a secret recording Liam had made on his phone, his cold threat about a tragic fire echoing through the silent courtroom. But the trial's heart was Ilara. On the stand, her small, frail body seemed to channel the strength of a generation of victims. Her voice, though soft, was unwavering. As she recounted the night she watched her best friend get dragged into the darkness, she pointed a trembling finger at Alistair Finch and, for the first time in 50 years, spoke the truth that had poisoned her life. "He murdered them," she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of absolute certainty. "He murdered my Sarah." The journal, the deeds, and Ilara's testimony were a triforce of truth that no army of high-priced lawyers could defeat. Justice, delayed for half a century, came down like a guillotine. In the quiet aftermath, Marcus Thorne sat down with Liam. The legalities were complex, but the conclusion was simple. The hidden fortune, meticulously documented in Thomas's journal as the proceeds from the sale of his personal assets, was legally the property of the Miller estate. As Silas Miller's only heir, the entire inheritance, the barn, the land, and the contents of the hidden compartment passed directly to Liam. The final tally was a number so large it felt fictional, an amount that Liam couldn't even visualize. "It's all yours, son," Thorne said, his voice gentle. "The land, the money, it's all clean." Liam looked over at Maya, who was now healthy and laughing, chasing dust motes in a sunbeam. He thought of Thomas Miller, building a secret ark for his own daughter. The ark hadn't sunk, it had simply been waiting, a time capsule of a father's love, ready to provide a future for another child who desperately needed one. A future that was now, impossibly, theirs. A year later, the sound that filled the house was not the howling wind, but the cheerful hum of a modern dishwasher. The scent was not of mold and decay, but of fresh-baked cinnamon rolls and brewing coffee. Liam stood in a bright, spacious kitchen, looking out a massive picture window at the green, rolling land that was his. His limp remained, a permanent echo of the fall that had started it all, but it no longer felt like a mark of failure. It was just a part of his story. Maya, her cheeks full and rosy, sat at a large oak table, diligently coloring a drawing of their new home, a beautiful, modern structure of glass and cedar that stood on the exact spot where the ruined barn had once slumped. He watched her, and a feeling of profound, bone-deep peace washed over him. The gnawing hunger, the cold, the terror, they all felt like a distant nightmare, a story that had happened to someone else. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost, but by what he had built. His transformation was not just internal. He picked up the phone from the granite countertop, his voice calm and confident. "Yes, Mrs. Garcia," he said, reviewing a file on his laptop. "Thorne's office has reviewed your deed. It's a classic Finch-style land grab. We can help you." He had honored the ghosts he'd unearthed. A significant portion of the Miller fortune had been used to create the Sarah and Thomas Miller Foundation, a non-profit legal fund dedicated to fighting predatory land fraud and helping families just like his own had been. The man who once couldn't provide a roof for his own child was now a shield for hundreds of others, using the very wealth born of a great injustice to create a new legacy of justice. He wasn't just a father or a landowner, he had become a guardian, ensuring that what happened in this valley would never happen again. Thomas Miller's last desperate act had become an enduring force for good. That evening, the three of them sat at the long oak table, Liam, Maya, and Ilara. The old woman, her eyes no longer haunted by fear but sparkling with a late-life joy, had become a permanent fixture in their lives, the grandmother Maya had never had. Maya pushed her latest drawing across the table. It showed 3 smiling stick figures under a rainbow. Liam looked from the drawing to the faces of his small, improbable family, and his heart felt so full it might burst. The contrast was a physical ache, the memory of huddling in the filth, sharing a stale crust of bread, now replaced by this scene of warmth, abundance, and unconditional love. He raised his glass of water in a silent toast, a toast to Thomas and Sarah, to Ilara's courage, and to the simple, profound miracle of a second chance. He had finally truly brought his daughter home. The ghosts of the Miller farm were at peace, their legacy fulfilled not in a desperate escape, but in this quiet, happy home. Liam and Maya's story is a powerful reminder that even from the ashes of the deepest despair, justice and hope can rise. It's a testament to the fact that a father's love can be a force strong enough to rewrite a tragic history and build a new future. Their journey from a cold city street to a warm, safe home is proof that no life is beyond redemption, and no evil is so powerful that it cannot be brought into the light by the courage of ordinary people. The echoes of the past can become the anthems of our future, if we are only brave enough to listen to them and fight for the stories that need to be told. If you were moved by their struggle and triumph, And if you believe that even one voice can make a difference, then make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications. You won't want to miss the incredible true stories of survival and justice we have coming next.